folks joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you today to a Women's and Gender Studies lecture delivered by Claudia Brinson. I am Dr. Carla Pfeffer. I'm the Director of Women's and Gender Studies, and I'm going to introduce Claudia Brinson, and then she's going to tell you about her wonderful new book. We're going to reserve some time for Q&A at the end of this session, so if you can just hold any comments or questions that you have until the very end, we will have a Q&A session after that. So Claudia Smith Brinson worked as a journalist for more than 30 years in Florida, Greece, and South Carolina. She was a national columnist and writing coach for Knight Ridder when the former newspaper chain owned The State in Columbia, South Carolina. Her reporting at The State won more than 36 state and regional awards. She was the first person to win Knight Ridder's Award of Excellence twice, and a member of the newspaper team whose Hurricane Hugo coverage was a Pulitzer finalist. Brinson published essays in national women's magazines, and her short fiction awards include the O. Henry, as well as recognition by the National League of Penn Women and Iowa Women Literary Journal. For almost 20 years, Brinson also taught a once semester, either journalism, nonfiction, or short story writing course at the University of South Carolina. From 2006 to 2016, Brinson taught writing, literature, and media courses at Columbia College, a private women's college in Columbia. She developed and directed the college's Writing for Print and Digital Media major and its media internship program. She held the Harriet Gray Blackwell Endowed Professorship. Brinson was named a South Carolina Woman of Achievement by the South Carolina Commission on Women and a South Carolina Journalist of the Year by the South Carolina Press Association. Her artists' books and collages traveled in museum shows. A short documentary was included in the Roxbury International Film Festival. Dr. Mary Baskin Waters collected her papers for the Archiving South Carolina Women Project at the University of South Carolina's South Carolina Political Collection. Her volunteer work includes tutoring and mentoring youth, writing workshops at shelters, and participation in Interfaith Partners of South Carolina and the South Carolina Dharma Group. She assists in production of the annual I Believe Anita Hill networking event, serves on our very own partnership council here in Women's and Gender Studies, and assists in development of a U of SC oral history collection of second wave feminists. With no further ado, I want to turn it over to Claudia Smith Brinson to talk about her new book, published at the University of South Carolina Press, Stories of Struggle, The Clash Over Civil Rights in South Carolina. Welcome, Claudia.
I'm so glad to be here, and thank you very much for coming on a Friday when the flowers are blooming and you might want to be outside in the rain. So I'm grateful you're here. I'm going to tell you very briefly about the book and then spend time talking about the 400 Black workers from the Medical University of South Carolina, which was in the Medical College Hospital, and the Charleston County Hospital, going on strike in 1969. And this strike was labeled by many the last big movement of the civil rights movement, last big event, the civil rights movement. So Stories of Struggle is a book that I sort of say I started writing on the minute I came into South Carolina. I'm not a South Carolinian, but my family has connections here. And in the early 80s, I had finished a graduate degree at USC, and I stayed here to work on the afternoon paper, the Columbia Record, and then the state newspaper, which was the morning paper. And I had lived 16 different places in 23 years. My dad was in the military. And so I was very used to being outsider and insider. So by that, I mean, I'm always moving as a young person into cultures that I didn't grow up in. I'm having to figure them out and figure out what my place might be. And at the same time, to figure this out, I'm having to observe constantly. And so that's great training for being a journalist too. And I was very, very shy. It was hard moving around so much and had sort of a crazy family. So there was not really any foundation to my life besides literature. I read a lot. And I lived in Japan for 4 years, from 6 to 10 years old, when you're pretty much, I think, developing a worldview. So my worldview is actually greatly influenced by Asian culture. And I went to high school in Hawaii, poor me, you know? But again, it was very much an Asian culture at that time. And so when I came to South Carolina, I started noticing right away that certain things were said and done that I hadn't experienced as a military brat. I wouldn't say that the military was integrated, but it was certainly desegregated in 1949 by President Harry Truman. And so I noticed not just it wasn't the remnants, it was the actual segregation of the culture continuing, but also what people said versus what I saw as a young reporter. And two of the things that stayed with me was, one of them might be familiar to some of you, was this saying, "Thank God for Mississippi." And what white South Carolinians meant by that was that they were 47 or 48 in all the bad things, but Mississippi was 50, so what? And I realized along the way that this actually had a great deal of racism attached to it, that although because of the great migrations, South Carolina was now majority white, the deepest poverty was Black. And I think people were dismissing poverty as a Black problem and therefore not the white power structures problem, which is cut off your nose to spite your face kind of thing. I also noticed that we had a sort of propaganda censorship kind of news media thing going on, which was that the focus was always on, and this is true of historians too, great white men. There was only, I think, one woman at that point in time in the legislature. She was white. And of course, there had only been one female lieutenant governor. And so if you think about the traditional idea of newsmakers, the newsmakers were white men. And so I immediately decided that I was going to have a career where I wrote about the people who weren't going to be written about if I weren't there. And that was a very large portfolio, because that meant I was writing about women, I was writing about minorities, I was writing about poor people, I was writing about children, I was writing about everybody except great white men. And so I refused to take any, the prestigious job is to cover the legislature and the governor, and I declined those honors when they were offered, and I stuck to education and social issues in my career. And along the way, I started interviewing Black elders, and I was struck with the incredible, powerful stories they were telling me, and it became, for me, a spiritual quest. It didn't develop into a book until early 2000, but I was constantly seeking out Black elders to write about their stories, and not just in Black History Month, because it seemed to me that there was great truths there that had not been told. South Carolina was not moderate during the Civil Rights Movement. I have no idea what was meant by moderate, except that maybe the murders and the lynchings and the economic repressions were just being successfully hidden. It was a brutal place to live if you were a Black person. And so the activists that I were meeting were just extraordinarily brave people to have stood up in such a dangerous place. And we can talk later, if you like, about, well, why was South Carolina successful in portraying itself as moderate? But I would like to focus on, hey, it's Women's History Month, on the women of the Charleston hospital strike. So I'm going to dare to share screen now and slightly disappear. I have some archival photographs, and I want to tell you the story through the photographs. And I think that will help you understand some of what was going on then. So this first photo is a picture after the strike has started, but I want to give you a little background. So in the 1940s, before and after World War II, there was a woman-dominated factory, the American Tobacco Factory, where cigars were made in South Carolina. And these women gathered together before and during World War II because they had very bad working conditions. They were paid poorly. And they started campaigning for better wages and better treatment. And of course, this is during the period of segregation. And they actually joined a union. So there was an American Tobacco Union. And after World War II, when some of the men came back into the factory, they went on strike, and it was a successful strike. So when women at the medical college hospital started talking about being under the same circumstances, they had elders that they could speak to about the circumstances they were in. So in 1945, the American Tobacco Company's refusal to raise pay had led to the strike. What the women were asking for was a 25-cent an hour raise. And after 8 months of the strike, they got an 8-cent an hour raise. And some great songs, including We Shall Overcome, became part of the anthem of these women, and they shaped it into the song that now you know as a civil rights song. And so the cigar factory strike was what I would say partially successful. The women got some of their goals met. In 1964, as you know, Lyndon Baines Johnson forced through the Civil Rights Act, and it made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And there was also an executive order that applied this to any place that took federal money. And of course, a big hospital like Medical College Hospital took several $1 million in federal money. So in 1965, pretty much immediately after this act, there were complaints filed with what was called the Health, Education, and Welfare Department about the abuses at Medical College Hospital. So at that point in time, there was the Medical College Hospital, Charleston County Hospital, Roper Hospital, and a small Catholic hospital. And only Charleston County Hospital had indigent care. Medical College Hospital was still practicing what was called Jim Crow segregation, meaning that there were all sorts of places where Black people were not welcome. So the majority of the people who were janitors, nurses' aides, cooks, housekeepers were Black. And this was the majority of the employees. However, how the hospital worked was that they were paid below minimum wage. There were 2 cafeterias in the hospital, one for doctors and one for everybody else, including guests. They were both for whites only. So if you were a Black employee or a Black guest visitor at the hospital, you had nowhere to eat. The restrooms were still segregated. There were very few for Black people. And the nurses' aides were expected to be training white practical nurses and white nurses in training. And there were no people that were Black that were accepted into those positions. And these young people who might be in training did not speak respectfully to the people who were expected to train them. They would call them by their first names, or they would even use abusive epithets. And this was the way it was. So in December 1967, what happened was some of the women were waiting on the neurology floor for the charge nurse to give them directions. So if you were a nurse's aide, there were limited things you could do. You could assess someone, you could take their temperature, but you could not, for example, administer medicine. And you had to get all your instructions about who got what and who needed what before you went onto the floor, and that was set into your schedule. However, this charge nurse decided it was taking too long, and she told the nurses' aides, just go out there. And they said, no, we can't. And they had a very good reason to say no. Not only was it not part of their job, but it could have gotten them fired and it could have caused harm. Charge nurse got angry, called in a supervisor nurse. The supervisor nurse said the same thing. The women said, we won't do this. There was a standoff for a couple of hours. And then these 5 women left the floor and went home. It was right before Christmas. They were horrified at what they had done. They knew that they might lose their jobs, and that's exactly what happened. They also, many of the women were single parents or an important wage earner in a 2-parent family or in a combined family. And they really couldn't financially afford to do this, but they were pretty much fed up. So HEW had appointed a committee to investigate the problems at Medical College Hospital. And among them was a Black member named Barrett. And he had connections throughout the community with white and Black people, because he was a very successful realtor. And another man, Isaiah Bennett, who was an employee of the American Tobacco Company's cigar factory and was actually a steward union. So the students, the nurses went to talk to them, and they went to talk to HEW, and HEW negotiated with the hospital, and the women got their jobs back. But along the way, they also started talking to the women who had formed the union. And there were other people here who were actually, this is 1969, invested in the Black Power movement. So you might know that in 1960, we had the sit-ins, and this was a shift from the NAACP domination of using lawsuits. Instead, it was what was called direct action. And out of that grew over time in the late 60s, the Black Power movement, where there was a greater urgency to confront. And so in South Charleston was a group that felt this way, and they were led by a man named Bill Saunders, and he had a newsletter. And so he started writing in his newsletter, "It's time to unionize." Now, I want you to look at this picture that I've left up here. Hospital workers keep on pushing. The cap that the young man in the front has on is a union cap because the union's going to come. But I want you to see that there are people here, there are women and children. And so this was a movement of families, but that is definitely not the way that South Carolina is going to respond. So the women started talking to Bill Saunders. They started talking to the members of the HEW community. And they also are meeting themselves at the Union Hall. And as you probably know, in April 1968, Reverend Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. And one of the Black Power representatives, Otis Robinson, said to the women, "You can't quit now. You need to do this for Dr. King." Because at this point in time, Dr. King is running the Poor People's Campaign, which is a challenge to the economic domination by white people. So again, I wanted you to see that this is a movement where there are women in their nurses' uniforms or their nurses' aide uniforms or in their regular work that are picketing. This is a street that's right across from Medical College Hospital. You could drive down the street and still see some of these old buildings. And so they began a conversation about what if we did have a union? Now, South Carolina was incredibly anti-union. And so what this meant was in the 1930s, when union workers started coming in to organize in South Carolina, they were shot. There were what we could fairly call massacres in the upstate, where people who walked off their jobs, it was called a sit down then, or sat in their job and refused to work, were shot by militia, military, and deputized civilians trying to stop the union strikes. In the 50s, Roger Milliken, who was a textile magnate, actually closed a Darlington textile factory when conversations started about a union. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court, who said, yes, well, business owners can close their business for whatever the reasons they want. So the Medical College Hospital President, William McCord, is getting very anxious about these conversations, and so is Governor Robert McNair. And William McCord was a pretty interesting white supremacist. He had grown up in South Africa, where his father ran a hospital that actually treated the Zulu tribe, but this was not benevolent missionary work. It was more patriarchal control, because in South Africa, if you were Black, you lived outside the cities and had to have passes to come into the cities for your work. There was complete control of the Black population. So Mary Moultrie and Lily Mae Dulster wrote to a union in New York City after a lot of these conversations. It was called Local 1199, and it was a well-established union in New York that was ready to start expanding. Lily Doster was one of the tobacco strike people, and so a guide for young women like Mary Moultrie. Mary Moultrie was a Charleston resident who had come back to Charleston after living in New York City. Her father was a dock worker, her mother cleaned houses, and Mary had gone off to New York and had worked as a licensed practical nurse there. When she came back to Charleston because her mother was ill, South Carolina wouldn't recognize her license, and she went from $4 an hour to $1.25 an hour. But she felt she needed to be home with her mother. And she knew Bill Saunders well, and as they began talking and pulled in Lily Doster and other union representatives to coach them, and and then got in touch with the New York Union, they began also quietly talking in the hospital to people about, tell a friend you trust, we're meeting. And so the meetings grew. And on a afternoon, after President McCord of the hospital had written a letter saying, we do not want a union here at Medical College, in all caps, and had sent cartoons that were highly offensive to these women. One of them showed a man in a top hat and a formal suit chomping on a stogie, and which is a big cigar, and swilling champagne and holding a woman by the waist while a chauffeur limousine waited behind him. And the caption was that, this was a union boss who's going to take all your money. There was another one of a union organizer holding a fistful of money. These women that you're seeing here, they found this highly offensive because the union could help them get a decent wage. The HEW wasn't stepping forward, the federal government. The South Carolina government was anti-union and anti their well-being. As still sort of a white supremacist, not sort of, a white supremacist organization. And here was the Medical College Hospital saying they want your money. And they knew that this was just completely not true. And at this point in time, the hospital had a 1.5 million surplus. So on December 6th, they held what was called a high noon walkout. They walked out at noon for their lunch hour and came back, and the officials at the hospital said, okay, we'll have a conversation. They arranged to have a conversation with Mr. McCord and 12 of the women who felt that they had become the representatives of this burgeoning union. And what happened was when they went to the meeting, Mr. McCord had drafted all sorts of people from throughout the hospital to oppose them. And the meeting quickly deteriorated. The women decided to walk out because he had clearly, he didn't show up. He had clearly sent in sort of all his flunkies. And so they went up to his office. They started answering the phone, local 1199B, because by this time they had voted to attempt to form a union, and they were waiting to hear from local 1199. A couple of them danced on the conference tabletops and celebrated. Several hundred employees gathered outside in the hall, and finally the Charleston police chief came and said, it'd be good if you left and went back to work, because otherwise I'm going to have to arrest you, which was a rather gentle way to stop this event, and very unlike how South Carolina usually behaved. So the 12 people who were most involved in this were immediately fired. They were Mary Moultrie, Louise Brown, Rosalie Fields, Priscilla Gladden, Mary Grimes, Helen Husser, Margaret Kelly, Annie Morris Lee, Vera Smalls, Virginia Stanley, Hazel White, and one man, Andrew Daniels. And they were also all at the lower levels of work. And I wanted to say their names because I think it's very important to remember the names of the people who are actually trying to make this world a better place. So what happens next is they get in touch with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And initially, people like Reverend Orange come in. Reverend Orange was an organizer, and he always wore these blue jeans. He was a chemistry doctorate professor who had left that to work with the conference. And he would come in and teach nonviolent direct action. And what you're seeing here is after the women were fired, they started picketing. They formally founded a union, and the picketing was limited. So they would come, they would pray. What they're doing here is kneeling at the building to pray, or they would sing, and they would get arrested. So there are now between 300 and 400 medical college hospital employees participating. And 1199 has sent down members of its national organizing committee. And as I said, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is sending some representatives in to see what's going on. And they're getting guidance, and I hope that we will talk about this later, from men who are very adept and practiced at organizing and organizing for with nonviolent purposes for the benefit of impoverished people. So Governor McNair is very unhappy about this, and he meets with Herbert Fielding, who was a very important person in the NAACP. Now keep in mind, we've got the women, we've got the union, and we've got the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The NAACP is not participating in this, but this is who Governor McNair meets with. Why? Because it's the organization that they're most comfortable, although not very comfortable with, talking to. They really do not want to talk to the women. So there are injunctions that are limiting how many people, as I said, can picket or gather outside the hospital, and pretty quickly there are arrests. And by March, Governor McNair is starting to send troops into Charleston. And Reverend Abernathy comes down. Here are the troops coming in. You can see this is serious. This is not just a few people with highway trooper uniforms on. This is also the National Guard. And they come in and they are armed. They have loaded guns. They have military uniforms on. The guns have sharpened sabers at the end. And they line up at all the marches to prevent people from gathering and marching. You'll see in this picture, which is on the cover of my book, that there are children in this group that are being met in this way. You'll also see a Catholic priest. The only white people who participated were Catholic priests. There were 2 or 3 white women who did come to some of the early meetings, but they were uncomfortable, and the Black organizers were uncomfortable too, and they quit attending. So the strikers' demands included better working conditions, lighter workloads, better wages, a grievance process, and the right to be a union member. And as Mary Moultrie constantly said, the right to be treated as human beings. So Ralph Abernathy now comes. He is trying to step into Reverend Martin Luther King's shoes. And this is a difficult time for him. He does not have the charisma, although he certainly has the experience as the right-hand man of Martin Luther King, to be the SCLC president. But there are questions about whether SCLC will survive. And so this becomes important to him and to the SCLC as a moment when they can reassert their preeminence and also push their Poor People campaign. So the women would meet at the Union Hall, and because they were now organized as a union, they actually got union support. So there was a few dollars that they could collect. There was also constant food at the Union Hall, and there was daycare. So think about that. We're still trying to get daycare for women. So it became a haven, a place to celebrate, but also a place where they were treated better than they were at work. So on April 4th, Abernathy comes back for a mass march. And because of the troops that are now pouring into Charleston, Mary Moultrie announces there are not going to be any more meetings with officials. They're going to practice civil disobedience. So this is Ralph Abernathy. He goes to from Charleston to Columbia to try to talk to the governor, who refuses to see him. And by the way, this is William McKinley Bowman, who was an NAACP officer in Columbia and owned a radio station and several businesses. Abernathy does not succeed, but he does gather money and support in Columbia and other cities. He returns for rallies, and there becomes a pattern of rallies almost every single weekend in which dignitaries from all over the United States come to support these women. For example, Cleveland Robinson, the president of the Negro American Labor Council, comes. The rallies become enormous. More than 1,000 people are often coming to these rallies. Here we have a march. Here's Reverend Orange again. If you look over to what would be I guess your left, and you'll see, if you count in 1, 2, 3, that's Rosetta Simmons. And by now the Charleston County Hospital has joined the strike with several hundred more Black women. Next to her is Juanita Abernathy. Next to her is Mary Moultrie, who I mentioned before. So Reverend Orange, 1, 2, 3, Rosetta Simmons, who's the leader from Charleston County Hospital, Juanita Abernathy, Coretta Scott King, who is now coming to support them, and Mary Moultrie. So when Coretta Scott King comes to Charleston, everybody wakes up because this is the widow of the Reverend King. She is coming out of her mourning period to speak publicly about how important Local 1199 was to Reverend King. They called it their favorite union, how she supports these women, how they are as important as Ida B. Wells or Rosa Parks, that they are not getting a living wage, and that is a shame. So we now have national attention. We have nationally important people coming to support these women. And what does McNair do? He orders in 1,000 guardsmen and he imposes a curfew. At this point in time, there's been no violence, only peaceful protests, but still there is a curfew. And one of the very interesting things in terms of interviewing was Mary Moultrie connected me with some of the people who were members of the Jackson Street Panthers. So by the time I talked to them, they're adults, but they were teenagers at the moment of the protest. And they were part of a street gang, but Reverend Orange trained them in nonviolent direct action. They even took them to Penn Center for weekend conferences. And these young men adopted nonviolent direct action and became the bodyguards for the women strikers who were being abused by the police when they were arrested. So these young men would step between the police baton and the woman. They would accept arrest, and in general, because they were young, they were under 21, they would be arrested, they would be held overnight, which you're not supposed to do without a charge, not charged, and let go the next morning. And so they were consistently out there protecting the women. Here's a close-up. You'll see Coretta Scott King in her beads and knit dress. And to one side of her with the straight hair is Rosetta. And to the other side of her is Mary. And so this is a very important march. And what happened is after these multiple marches throughout April, there had been some brief violence at the very beginning of May. There were some curfew violations. There were rocks thrown into the windows of businesses on King Street. And there was random gunfire at night. It's not clear who was doing this. There weren't many arrests because it was pretty much anonymous. But what happened was there was a rally. Abernathy came in and said that this was a violence, was discrediting the movement, and that he was going to put out a national call for more support. The city was in a crisis, but it should not be a crisis that included violence. And so if you go from left to right, you should recognize, I'm sorry, it's my left, you're right, Rosetta Simmons, and then this is the Walter Reuther, head of the United Auto Workers Union, Mary Moultrie, and I interviewed Mary at length and I started teasing her about this. You'll see in their pictures that her afro gets more and more aggressive. It's really rather cool. And she's wearing what she called her favorite dress for these events. It was a lightweight knit shift that was pale blue. Next to her is Ralph Abernathy and Juanita Abernathy, who was very active in the civil rights movement, Joseph Lowry and his wife, Evelyn Lowry, who also was very active. These women were true partners to their husbands. They just didn't make it onto the covers of newspapers and magazines. The man in front, who seems to be wearing a cowboy outfit, was part of a security guard from Chicago. They call themselves the Rangers. And they actually rode white horses and wore white clothes with red scarves. This is another picture. I'm sorry that it's out of focus, but you can see how packed. Here's our same people in the front line, but you can see that it's dense because this is a rally that has more than 5,000 people attending it. And finally, there is a Mother's Day rally, May 11th, and a Mother's Day march. Ralph Abernathy initially leads it, but then in the very center there in the striped sweater, that is Jesse Jackson, who you remember as an early Black presidential candidate. He was leading the SCLC in Chicago, and he stepped in to lead the march when Ralph Abernathy had to go to something else. The Mother's Day March was really important. There was a 4-day rally of several thousand people. There were 5 congressional representatives, union representatives. Rosa Parks came and gave flowers to Mary Moultrie. William Kirchner of the AFL-CIO came and donated thousands of dollars. The march itself was 10,000 to 15,000 people. So you can see that this movement is growing week by week and getting more and more attention and more support. But what is happening in terms of our government? Well, South Carolina's white leaders are refusing to talk to people about the strike. They're also not willing to talk to the union leaders. And Mr. McCord, the president at the hospital, and the leader at the Charleston County Hospital are also refusing to talk to the women. So things are truly at a standstill. And at this moment, the HEW, which keep in mind, they've been violating, they've been enforcing segregation since 1969. Since 1964, it's become illegal. The HEW finally starts to do its job, and this is because of activists, white and black, in the Nixon's cabinet, and they start putting pressure. So do a couple of bankers, because they're extremely worried that the strike will spread to the dock and to federal workers. There had been a recent strike that cost the nation several $1 million, and by now, Charleston, because it relies on tourism, has lost several $1 million, and they're afraid it's going to be in the tens and hundreds of millions if the dock workers join the strike. So Ralph Abernathy is arrested, and he's arrested praying, lifted up from praying on his knees, put in jail. He's been arrested more than 20 times at this point, but he's put in jail on a $50,000 bond. And this is obviously a punitive bond, and he decides to stay in jail. By now, Mary Moultrie has been in jail. They've singled her out, of course, and Rosetta Simmons and Naomi White, who was another leading participant. And they've stayed in jail for 2 weeks before a judge orders them out, because he's worried that violence is going to exacerbate if they're not out of jail. So at the end of June, there is, this is more, I'm sorry, this is another picture of the march. I wanted you to see that, you know, there's great participation, and I think it's very important that the women were often in their uniforms to make the point that they were workers. And this is the Chicago Jazz Band. So there were celebrations, just as I showed you the women singing in the Union Hall. It wasn't all walking in tension. There were groups like this. Some famous comedians came in, and famous musicians for some of these rallies. And this jazz band was bringing up the end of the march. So the negotiations finally began. This is Andrew Young and Elliot Godoff with the union in the middle, and then Mary with her more dramatic afro. Andrew Young later became a UN ambassador. And they finally managed to get the president to begin talking with them. He kept saying no union, and he wouldn't hire back the strikers. It went on for a month. Finally, because of the pressure from the federal government, the hospital bends and says it will end the strike, but it won't recognize a union. And the women who want their pay and their dignity accept that what will happen is they will have a union that's not officially recognized, and they accept that this is going to mean that collecting union dues will be very difficult. And so while they do get their requests, and it benefits all the people of South Carolina, because the governor is forced to create a pay scale and a job ladder for the state government, which has never existed. The women do not get a lasting union, but they do get their other requests met. And I wanted you to see them before they passed on. This is Mary Moultrie about 7 or 8 years ago. This is Rosetta Simmons. I'm sorry, this is Naomi White, who, by the way, have freckles and red hair, and created a group she called the Hell Angels. And they would meet people who were walking into into work and not on strike, and confront them in a peaceful, but I think very loud way about what they were doing. And this is, I don't have an older picture of Rosetta Simmons, but this is a close-up of Rosetta Simmons again. So I hope you have some questions for me. I'm really flying through this. I think there's some questions about men and women in leadership. There are questions about white supremacy possible here. There are questions about what it means to have a union. As you probably know, Amazon is going to be voting its workers on a union in a deep South state. There are questions about when white supremacy tries to create, I believe, in terms of the governor sending down armed troops, a violent situation when the protesters are actually trying to have a peaceful situation. That might remind you of some of the Black Lives Matter movement, where the protesters were trying to be peaceful and the police were not. So there are a lot of echoes here. And I did, I'm hoping you're going to have questions, but I did want to add one other thing. I did go back toward the end of working on being ready to write this and ask Mary and Rosetta and Naomi, who as the leaders were my main interview subjects, what they thought themselves about leadership. And they did feel that they were the leaders of the women, but they felt that they had no experience in leading a strike, in leading a large movement, in training in nonviolent direct action, in what the habits of a union were. And so they felt that they were very grateful for the SCLC and the union coming in. The deficit there would be that lots of times this story is not often told. It has been told a few times as a union story and as an SCLC story, which I find remarkable. There are 400 women out there on the streets with their kids, but it's not their story. So I hope that my book remedies this in some way. And it is the last third of the book that begins with the Briggs versus Elliott petitioners in the 40s, and the middle is on the 1960 sit-ins, and then the last third is on these women. So please ask me some questions. I'd be glad to hear from you from chat or with your voice. I think you're being unmuted.
Yeah,
so you're not silenced anymore. Don't silence yourselves.
Yeah, we had a little muting issue. So folks should be able to you can either contribute a question in one of two ways. You could either unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question, or if you're more comfortable, you can submit it through the chat. I'm happy to read the question submitted through the chat if you would prefer. While folks are doing that, while folks are thinking about questions that they might have, considering unmuting yourselves, sending a question through the chat, I have a question that's more kind of about your process through all of this. You had mentioned at the beginning that you started this process of gathering some of these narratives in the early 2000s. Is that correct?
That would be when I said, yes, it's going to be a book. And that happened because someone said at a civil rights conference, you know more than most of the people here. Why isn't this a book? And I got to admit that my first response was, I'm a single parent. I have a full-time job. I have part-time work, teaching and freelancing. Ha, 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 write a book. And then I thought, yeah, it's got to be a book. I'm going to make it work.
Yeah, I would love to kind of hear your thoughts about that process, because if we think about what today is all about, it's social media. It's incredibly fast moving. Things are happening, a mile a minute. But this is really, a labor of love that began over 20 years ago for you. So I'm wondering if you can kind of connect these two pieces about the pace of the current moment, but the amount of time and labor that it takes to produce a work like the work that you've produced, and kind of how you reconcile these two things and how you understand the contribution of the work in this current environment that we're all living in today.
Okay, so when I introduced myself, I said that I was noticing right away that the Black elders' stories were missing, and so I was lucky, or I shouldn't call it luck. I won lots of writing awards, and so I managed to turn myself into what was called a senior writer, which meant I had authority, and I had the money of an editor, but I could continue to write because that's what I wanted to do. And I could self-assign myself. So I did have lots of arguments with all the editors were white men initially about doing these kind of stories, but I was dedicating myself to trying to collect stories. And a perfect example of this would have been the 40th anniversary, so 1954, this is 94, the 40th anniversary of Briggs versus Elliott. It occurred to me that I hadn't seen anything on the 30th anniversary when I was already in South Carolina. Briggs versus Elliott was the first of 5 lawsuits to become Brown versus the Board of Education, which, as you know, declared unconstitutional the segregation of public schools. Many people agree it's the most important legal decision that the US Supreme Court has ever made. And so I was just stunned. Why aren't these people being written about? And people in Columbia didn't know who to connect me to. I went to Clarendon. I found people who were petitioners who were still living there, and I started writing about them. And I thought, this is not just a journalism quest. This is a spiritual quest. This is about people who are, a lot of these people were born in the late 1890s, who are going to be dead soon, and their stories will die with them. And I'm not going to let that happen. So all along the way, I was collecting stories, and I managed, this is really rare at a newspaper. I had an office. I had a gargantuan, it filled one wall, file case where I kept all my good notes. This is back when you're taking notes and maybe tape recording, you know, you're not sticking your phone in somebody's face. And so that became part of my book too, all that information. When I started writing the book as a book, it was very difficult. I'm sort of an immersion writer. I want to sink into it and lose myself in it. And I was doing it on weekends. As I said, I was a single parent. My ex-husband lived in town. So my kids would be over with him on a weekend, except I'm driving for soccer and I'm getting an hour or two here or there. I would use my vacation time, some of my vacation time with my children, and some of it where I would be writing at home. And so it was pieced together over a great period of time. And I think there are many books that are actually written that way, where people are living double or triple lives and trying to get the writing done. I didn't talk about the book much because people would be like, oh, are you still working on that book? You know, I'm sure a lot of people thought, oh, she's going to die and the kids are going to throw it out in a garbage bag. You know? But I believe, because the stories were so important, and this book is full of stories. It's not a historical event by event book. It's a people by people by people book. Their stories collected around these moments in time. I didn't have conversations about the book, but I didn't worry about other people's doubt. I knew I was going to get it done unless a tree fell on me. You know, that it was one of the things that I needed to do with my life. So I just kept working on it. And at a certain point, USC Press was interested, and I tore it apart because it needed to be shorter, and did that while a ceiling was leaking right next to me. I'm ripping apart a book, and in the background's drip, drip. Actually, that was too regular. It's drip, drip. Yeah, driving me somewhat insane. But I wanted it to, I know there are problems actually with going to a big press versus a university press in terms of marketing and things like that, but it felt that it was a book that needed to be fostered in South Carolina and then go out into the world. So that was my choice. So I also think of myself as a writer. And I have a friend who's a historian who says, Claudia, you've written a book that has history in it, you're a historian. You know? But I think of myself primarily as a writer who chose to be a journalist. I was, as I said, shy, and I discovered I was overwhelmingly curious and really cared about how other people live their lives and wanted to know about that. And I was not shy when I was interviewing. And so I have really shaped myself and my life around that sort of professional identification too. And so it was a natural outgrowth, you know, to find these collections of stories and to see that they were missing and would always be missing if I didn't step forward, because literally I was one step ahead of death sometimes. I actually had phone calls where I was calling for a second interview and the person I'd interviewed had passed on before I could get back to the second interview.
Thank you for that.
See questions over here. Yay.
Yeah, you have a couple. So I'm not sure if folks want to unmute and ask these questions themselves, or if I should go ahead and read them. Rory is the first question here. Rory, do you want to ask your question yourself, or would you prefer if I read it? I'm not sure. You can read it. Okay. So the question is, what originally drew you to write about this strike, Claudia?
Okay. So the book, the first portion that I wrote about was the Briggs petitioners. They were the oldest people for the book, and so they had to be interviewed as quickly as I could. And in many cases, I did have to interview their children, for example. But all along the way, I'm noticing that I'm going to have to go to special links to make sure that women are well represented in the book. And so I started thinking about how am I going to do that? And so I initially wrote a chapter that was short biographies of women in different towns in South Carolina who had done something in particular, like a woman in Sumter who desegregated the swimming pools and the March of Dimes and the YWCA. But I felt that was, it wasn't immersive. And so somewhere along the way, I found out that not only about the hospital strike, but that several of the women who were the leaders were still alive and are willing to talk to me. And so I felt like that would balance the book. It would give women a story. It was good too in terms of moving through time. It shows how movements change. So you have the NAACP structure with the Briggs versus Elliott, where petitioners are signing up to give up their lives pretty much to harassment and economic pressure and death threats for a lawsuit, to the students going out in peaceful confrontation, to the women going out in peaceful confrontation, but with violence circling around them, because before the hospital strike, there had been several summers in which cities just blew up with racial tensions. So it felt, as a writer, the right direction to be going in, and it also fulfilled my purpose of not having this be a story about in the 40s men and women, and then in the 60s men in charge and some women. I wanted to have women in charge of a movement too, and they were there. They were there. So does that answer your question, Rory? I've also got to say, these were great people, you know. Mary, one of the things I should say about movements is, if you're going to be in a movement, you have to have perseverance. It's not just courage, because you don't have to have courage. You could be painting the signs. You know, you could be plotting the marching route. You don't have to be out there in the front lines, but you do have to have perseverance. And you have to have some foundation you're working on, some belief. For a lot of these people, it was their church, but for other people, it was righteousness, you know, or it was their children. So there's a foundation belief, and there's also got to be no expectation that you are going to profit. So Mary Moultrie ended up working for the Charleston strikes, Charleston Park and Recreation Department. And Rosetta and Naomi ended up staying in nursing, but in private nursing, because they were harassed so much when they came back to the hospitals. So that struck me too, that they were part of this story of, you give your all and you do improve things for everybody else, but you're going to have to accept that you personally may not profit. So that drew me to their story too.
I am Liz G. Would you like to read your own question or have me read it? Okay, so the question is, I know you talked about growing up around Asian influence in Hawaii and Japan. Do you have any other pieces about the Asian community and other minority groups like you did for the Black community?
Well, I haven't been asked this question yet, but I have been longing for it because, why do you pick a certain thing? So certainly we are being confronted now with the murders of anti-Asian racism, and that just it's like any other kind of racism. It's got a long history in the U.S. When Asian people came in and were imported in to work on the railroads, they were treated as not white and kept out of segregated schools too, for example. And think about the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, that we rob people of land, we march them across the United States and they're dying along the way. And then we isolate them and enforce their poverty. We take their children from them and put them in boarding schools. So I'm also a short story writer, and I know at some point I'm going to be writing about living in Japan. If you looked at my house, you would see Japanese influences everywhere. My idea of beauty definitely comes from the Japanese culture. But I don't think in what's left of my life that I will shift focus to other minority groups unless I decide that I have a very long life to live, because I'm at sort of the tail end of my life. And I really do think now in terms of, I took a very long time with this book. What do I have time to do next? And I don't have an answer for that yet, but I am thinking in that way. And I'm not sure I could learn enough. I talked about immersion. I like to know my stuff before I sit down and write, and I'm not sure that I can learn enough. Although in Columbia, I did some reporting on this. For example, I was at a state school board meeting, the State Board of Education meeting, in which a member of the board started railing about wanting to put the 10 Commandments up, and a lawyer had said, you can't do that, we are not a nation, we're a nation under God, but we're not a nation that enforces Christianity. And he was highly offended and started talking about the 10 Commandments. And I thought, what is this man talking about? Every culture and every religion has a thou shalt not kill, for example. And so I wrote I used to write almost like section long pieces, which is like a pamphlet, a booklet, rather than a newspaper article. I did one on all the different religions represented in Columbia and what their commandments were, and there are many, many, you'd be surprised how many Christian Asian churches. I'm Buddhist, which is Asian, although I follow the Dalai Lama's teachings, and that's Tibetan Buddhism, but there are Sikh temples, there are Islamic temples, there are Buddhist organizations, there are Korean Christian churches, there are Native American tribal sweat lodges. They're all here in Columbia. You just have to go look for them. This is actually a very diverse city. It just doesn't look that way at first glance. Got to pay attention.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I am so appreciative to you for joining us for this hour. I am mindful of the time that we are at 3 o'clock. So I do want to thank everyone for attending and encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to think about buying Claudia's book. Again, it's available through the University of South Carolina Press. And again, thank you, Claudia.
Let me add too, if you enjoyed the pictures and you want a free look at what's there, I have a website, storiesofstruggle.com, that I'm developing, and it has some portions of the book, but also a lot of new material and lots of these beautiful archival photographs that I've gotten permission to use.
That's
so
great.
Thank you. Hope you go to the website. If you have a book club, invite me.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Carla.
All right. Have a great day, a great weekend to everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.